Burbank, California, November 11th, 1974. NBC Studio One. The taping had stopped. Not for a technical fault, not for a missed cue. It had stopped because Johnny Carson, the most powerful man in American late-night television, had risen from behind his desk, walked to the edge of the set, and pointed at a guitar. Not at the man holding it, at the guitar. The instrument lying across Ace Frehley's lap looked like it had survived a disaster. The finish was chipped down to bare wood. The bridge had been resoldered twice. One tuning peg was wrapped in electrical tape. It was the kind of guitar a person walked past at a yard sale without looking twice. And yet the man in the silver face paint, the black star across his left eye, the platform boots adding 4 inches to his frame, had carried it into the most watched studio in America, as though it were worth everything. Carson looked at the guitar, then at the man. 300 people in the studio audience went completely silent. No laughter, no whispers, just the low hum of the overhead lights, and 300 people holding their breath. What Carson said next, in that flat, measured tone that had made him the most feared interviewer in television, was not picked up by the boom mic. The floor director's face went pale. Fred DeCordova, watching from the production booth above the studio floor, leaned forward in his chair. In 22 years of producing television, he had never seen Johnny Carson do what he was about to do next. But to understand why, and why Ace Frehley didn't flinch, you have to go back. Not to the studio, not to the makeup, back to a Bronx basement, and a boy with a broken instrument, and one thing left to prove. If you've never heard this story, stay until the very end. And if you're new here, subscribe. This one matters. Paul Daniel Frehley was born on April 27, 1951, in the Bronx, New York, the third child of a sheet metal worker and a homemaker who stretched every dollar until it tore. The apartment on Intervale Avenue was small, loud, and full of people. There was no extra money for lessons, no budget for instruments, no one in the family who had ever set foot on a stage. But there was a neighbor on the 4th floor named Eddie Kruger, who owned a K archtop guitar, a cheap department store instrument that had cost $17 used. One afternoon in 1963, when Paul was 12 years old, Eddie left it propped against the hallway wall and forgot about it for 3 hours. Paul didn't forget about it for the rest of his life. He sat cross-legged in that hallway and taught himself 4 chords before Eddie came back for it. By the time he did, something had already been decided. Paul's father, Harold Frehley, was not a man who believed in dreams that didn't pay rent. When his son asked for a guitar of his own, Harold said one thing and meant it completely. If you are going to do this, do it so that nobody can ignore you. Then he went back to work. There was no follow-up conversation, no encouragement wrapped around it. Just that one sentence, delivered like a fact. Paul bought his first guitar with money saved from odd jobs, a battered second-hand instrument with 3 dead frets and a cracked nut. He practiced in the basement so the neighbors wouldn't complain. He practiced until his fingertips split. He practiced through 2 New York winters without heat in that basement, sitting under a single bare bulb, figuring out every song he heard on the radio by ear, because he couldn't afford a single lesson. By the time he was 20, he had renamed himself Ace. By 22, he had joined a band called Kiss. And the guitar he brought with him into that band, a road-scarred 1959 Gibson Les Paul Jr. he had pulled from a roadside ditch outside Albany after a van accident in 1972, restrung the same night and played a full set with the very next evening, was the same guitar now lying across his lap on the set of The Tonight Show. To everyone else in that studio, it looked like a piece of junk. To Ace Frehley, it was the only thing in his life that had never once let him down. The Tonight Show booking had not come easily. Kiss had been together barely 2 years. 3 albums recorded, 0 mainstream radio play. Their concerts were loud, theatrical, and drawing real crowds. But to the network executives at NBC, they were still a novelty act in face paint, not a legitimate musical force worth 30 minutes of primetime television. The booking had been secured through Bill Aucoin, their manager, who had called in a favor from a music industry contact with a direct line to the show's production office. The internal NBC memo circulated that week described the band as, quote, a costumed rock group, likely suitable for a single novelty appearance. No follow-up booking was anticipated. That memo was never officially retracted. What happened instead simply made it irrelevant. Aucoin pulled Ace aside in the corridor outside the green room at 7:45 that evening. His instruction was short and without softness. Do not give Carson any reason to make this a joke. Ace nodded once and said nothing. He went into the green room, sat down in the corner chair, and placed the Les Paul Jr. across his knee. He ran the same chord sequence over and over, not warming up, calming down. At 8:15, a production assistant knocked on the green room door. Mr. Carson would like to meet the band briefly before taping. Carson came in himself, silver-haired, suit-pressed, the easy confidence of a man who had done this 10,000 times. He shook hands with Gene Simmons, with Paul Stanley, with Peter Criss. Then he reached Ace, and his eyes dropped, not to Ace's face first, but to the guitar across his lap. He studied it for a moment without speaking. Then he looked up. Is that the guitar you're planning to play tonight? Ace met his eyes. Yes, sir. Same one every night. Carson nodded slowly. He said nothing else. He turned and walked back out into the corridor. Nobody in that green room spoke for a full 10 seconds after the door closed behind him. Gene Simmons, who could fill any silence in any room on earth, said nothing. Paul Stanley looked at the floor. Peter Criss stopped pacing, and Ace Frehley sat exactly where he had been sitting, the worn neck of the Les Paul Jr. resting in his left hand, his thumb moving quietly across the low E string, because he had heard something in Carson's voice that the others hadn't. Not mockery, not dismissal, something quieter than both, something that felt exactly like a test, and somewhere in the back of his mind, his father's voice answered it. If you are going to do this, do it so that nobody can ignore you. The red light above the studio door blinked on. There was no more time for anything else. Stay with us, because what happened the moment Ace walked out onto that stage is something nobody in that building saw coming. Kiss walked out onto the set of The Tonight Show at 9:02 in the evening, and the studio audience did something that nobody on the production team had anticipated. They laughed. Not the warm, welcoming laughter of a crowd greeting a familiar act. The sharp, involuntary laughter of 300 people who did not know what they were looking at. 4 men in full theatrical makeup, platform boots and black leather, walking single file across the most mainstream television set in America, as though they had always belonged there. Carson was already behind his desk. He watched the entrance with the same unreadable expression he brought to every guest. Measured, controlled, giving nothing away. He gestured to the chairs. They sat. The interview began. He asked about the makeup. Gene answered. He asked about the stage show. Paul answered. The conversation was professional, structured, good television. Carson was too skilled to let the visual spectacle derail the rhythm of the segment. For 4 minutes, everything moved exactly as it was supposed to move. Then Carson turned to Ace. It was a small shift, barely a degree in his chair, but the camera caught it. And before he looked at Ace's face, his eyes went to the guitar, just for a half second, the same way they had in the green room. That is quite a guitar you have there, he said. The audience responded immediately. A ripple of laughter moved through the studio, because on television, in that room, under those lights, the instrument looked even worse than it had in the green room. The chipped finish, the electrical tape, the road damage accumulated across 2 years of bars and clubs and 1 highway ditch outside Albany. Ace said nothing. He waited. Carson leaned forward slightly in his chair, a movement the Tonight Show's floor director would later describe as the tell he had only ever seen Carson use when he was genuinely interested in something. Then Carson said the words that stopped the room. "I'll be honest with you. That looks like it has been through a war. So here's what I want to know. Can something that looks like that still play?" And he turned to the audience and said, "Why don't we find out?" The studio went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something unscripted is happening and everyone senses it at the same moment. Fred DeCordova, in the production booth, sat fully upright in his chair. This was not in the rundown. This was not in any version of the segment he had approved. Carson had gone off script entirely, in front of 18 million people, and challenged a guest to perform without warning, without setup, without a safety net of any kind. Every person on that set looked at Ace Frehley, and Ace Frehley looked down at the guitar in his hands. 1 full second passed, then another. In that silence, 300 people waited for a man in silver face paint to either rise to the most unexpected moment of his career or fold under the weight of it. What nobody in that studio knew was what was moving through Ace's mind in that exact moment. Not the audience, not the cameras, not Carson himself, because what Ace Frehley was seeing was not a television studio at all. He was seeing a Bronx basement, a single bare bulb, a battered second-hand instrument with 3 dead frets, and a father who had delivered exactly 1 sentence worth remembering. "If you are going to do this, do it so that nobody can ignore you." Ace stood up. He didn't look at Gene. He didn't look at Paul. He walked to the amp at the edge of the set, plugged the guitar in himself, adjusted 1 knob, and turned back to face the room. 300 people, 18 million at home, a guitar that looked like it belonged in a trash can. He closed his eyes and played the first note. The first note stopped the room, not because it was loud. It wasn't. It came out of that battered Les Paul Jr. at a volume that barely filled the front half of the studio. But it was precise in the way that only years of obsession produce precision. Every frequency controlled, every harmonic intentional, a sound that had no right coming from an instrument that looked the way that instrument looked. The stage manager, standing at the left wing of the set, said afterward that the hair on his forearms stood up before the second bar was finished. He had been working live television for 11 years. He had never said that about anything before. Ace played the opening of Shock Me, the song he had written himself, the song where he had stepped to the front microphone and sung lead for the first time in his life. The song that was as close to autobiography as anything he had ever put on tape. His fingers moved without hurry. Every note breathed. Every pause between notes carried as much weight as the notes themselves. And the guitar, the chipped, resoldered, electrical tape guitar that the studio audience had laughed at 4 minutes earlier, sang like something that had been waiting its entire life for exactly this room. The laughter was gone. Every trace of it. 300 people who had walked into NBC Studio One expecting a novelty act sat in complete silence and listened. The woman in the 3rd row, who had leaned to her husband and whispered they let them wear that on television, had stopped moving entirely. She was watching Ace's left hand. Carson had gone still behind his desk. The pen he always kept moving during musical performances, tapping, clicking, the small restless gesture his production team knew as well as their own names, was motionless on the desk in front of him. He was simply watching, the way a person watches something they did not expect to move them and cannot pretend it isn't. At the peak of the solo, Ace bent a single sustained note and held it, stretched it past the point where most guitarists would have released it. And in that held note, something happened in the room that nobody who was there ever fully found the words for. The studio did not erupt. It deepened. 300 people leaned forward at the same moment without knowing they were doing it. When the last note finally released, the silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Johnny Carson did something his production team had never seen him do in 22 years of live television. He didn't wait for the audience. He started the applause himself, both hands leaning forward over his desk, leading the room. Then he picked up his microphone and said 4 words that nobody in that studio would ever forget. And what those 4 words were, and what Carson did immediately after the commercial break, is the part of this story that history almost never tells. If this story is hitting different, hit that like button right now and subscribe if you haven't yet. We are just getting to the part that changes everything. The 4 words Johnny Carson spoke into that microphone, "not bad for worthless," landed in the studio like something physical. The audience erupted. Not the polite, rhythmic applause of a television crowd following a cue. Something rawer than that. The kind of noise a room makes when 300 people have just witnessed something they know they will describe to someone else tomorrow morning. Ace lowered the guitar. He looked at it once. Then he looked at Carson. He didn't smile the way Gene would have smiled. Wide, theatrical, built for cameras. He simply nodded, once. The nod of a man who had always known something and had just been asked to prove it. Carson nodded back. That exchange lasted less than 2 seconds. It was never discussed in any interview either man gave afterward. But Fred de Cordova saw it from the production booth, and he wrote about it 11 years later in his 1988 memoir. He described it as the clearest communication he had ever witnessed between 2 people who had never met before that evening. The commercial break came 90 seconds later. Carson rose from his desk, walked around to the production corridor behind the set, and found de Cordova waiting for him. What Carson said took less than 10 seconds to deliver. "Book them again, whenever they want." De Cordova asked all 4 of them. Carson turned back toward the set and said, "Especially the quiet one." That conversation, 60 words exchanged in a television corridor during a 90-second commercial break, was the first time a mainstream American institution had looked at Kiss and seen something other than a costume. But what happened in that same corridor 20 minutes later, when a 19-year-old NBC page stopped Ace Frehley with 3 sentences that would redirect the next decade of his life? That is the detail that has never made it into any account of that night. That 19-year-old NBC page stopped Ace in the corridor as the band was being escorted out. His name was Michael Geller. It was his first week on the job. He stood in the hallway under the fluorescent lights and said 3 things: that he had grown up with nothing, that music was the only thing that had ever made sense to him, and that what he had just heard come out of that guitar had made him believe, for the first time, that where you started had nothing to do with where you could go. Ace looked at him for a moment. Then he reached into the guitar case, pulled out a spare pick, and pressed it into the young man's hand. "Keep playing," he said. "Whatever you've got, keep playing." Then he walked out into the Burbank night with the Les Paul Jr. under his arm. Michael Geller kept the pick. By 1981, he was producing music segments for network television. Within 3 weeks of the Carson appearance, Kiss concert bookings increased by 340%. Radio stations in 14 markets that had refused to play their music requested advance copies of their next album. The label doubled the promotional budget. The industry that had called them a novelty act in an internal memo rewrote its assessment without ever formally admitting it had been wrong. But none of that is the real legacy of November 11th, 1974. The real legacy is simpler than any of it. A boy from the Bronx walked into the most powerful room in American television, carrying a guitar that looked like it had nothing left to give. And he walked out having proved what his father told him in a basement 20 years before. That if you are going to do this, do it so nobody can ignore you. He did. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because every week we find the stories that history almost forgot.